Hello, friends. Today I am joined by Andrew Pudewa. I'm sure not a stranger to many of you, but if he is new to you, Andrew is the founder and director of the Institute of Excellence in Writing and a father of seven. Traveling and speaking around the world, he addresses issues related to teaching, writing, thinking, spelling, and music with clarity, insight, practical experience, and humor. His seminars for parents, students, and teachers have helped transform many a reluctant writer and have equipped educators with powerful tools to dramatically improve their students' skills. He is also a previous guest here on Homeschool Conversations. I'm delighted to chat with you again. Since people can go back and listen to that previous episode for a kind of more personal introduction here, I thought today we'd just jump right in with some questions. What you think?
Sounds good.
Well, I'm sure you, like our family, are familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's one of our favorite books to read as a family. And we often will quote the professor's famous line, logic. Why don't they teach logic in these schools? And that's certainly as relevant now as it was when Lewis wrote those words. But sometimes I almost just think we need to go more basic. Like, why don't they teach thinking in these schools? So I would like to hear from you. What are some ways that you kind of see this as an issue in the modern era? And do you see various skills involved in thinking that they've kind of deteriorated? What are your kind of thoughts about that?
So recently I've been pondering a quote from Francis Bacon in his essay on studies. And it's a very elegant quote. He said that reading maketh a full man, speaking a ready man, and writing an exact man. And that resonates a lot with what we do at IEW because we say we teach the arts of language, listening, speaking, reading, writing, and then the result is thinking. And, and so if we were to kind of look at the problem of non-thinking, if you want to call it that, of today's world, and I think every generation has complained about the previous one, and every century thinks they're better than the previous one. And certainly there have been times where luminary people have shown phenomenal thinking. And I would guess there's always been a good contingent of people who find it just to be too much trouble and will either ignore it or outsource it. But there's two sides of it, and I think Bacon hit that we have to have input, right? We have to have things that build our memory and our imagination and our knowledge base, because without that, output and the proof of thinking is not possible. I mean, the output, the speaking and writing part is really kind of the proof of the thinking, or facilitates the process of clarifying the thinking. So a good chunk of my talking to people, and I honestly don't remember what we talked about last time, but uh, I tend to push pretty hard, especially parents with school age children, and that you've got to get it in there. You've got to build the vocabulary. You've got to build the syntax. You've got to have the inherent grammar. You've got to have the general knowledge. You've got to have the literary sense. You've got to have this experience of language that really forms your capacity to use language to think. And I would guess this idea came to me a long, long, long time ago when I was face to face with a group of kids who would say things like, I don't know what to write, or I can't think of anything. Or they would write something and it would be just miserably empty and bad and unuseful. And then you think, okay, how can I get them to do better than this? And I realized you can only express an idea, and by extension, you can only think a thought, that you have the words to think it in. And so with this reading aloud to kids, and other people have kind of hopped on this bandwagon, much to my delight, Sarah McKenzie and some of our other, outspoken homeschool podcast blogger types have really pushed this idea of reading in huge quantity to kids, and then getting from that, hopefully, a desire for them to read, and a desire not just to read for amusement, but the desire to read hard things, to read things that are going to stretch them, that might actually send them to a dictionary. Although I know a few children who have even touched a dictionary, but dictionary.com, I don't care what you use, but engaging in that more kind of strenuous level of reading, I think is critical if you're going to get to a more effective mode of thinking. So that would be step one, the input.
It's interesting because actually our previous conversation was all about beautiful memory work and the value of that. And that's something I am passionate about and I've seen in my own family. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about that, aphorism, thoughts untangle themselves over the point of a pen. But if you don't have something to think about first, then there's nothing really to untangle, right? And so just thinking about how that relates to the things we read, the things we memorize, the things we contemplate, and how that thought comes first before we're able to then communicate it. But I wonder, we've mentioned already reading, memory work, things like this, but what are some ways that we can really nurture these critical thinking skills in our children, in our students, especially as homeschooling parents?
Yeah, so the second part of Bacon's quote is speaking, or I think what he said was conference makes a ready person, right? So when you are engaged in a conversation, someone asks you a question, you have to immediately go find something in the memory that was put there somehow, in some way, and attach it to the question at hand. And that's where logic comes in. So causal relationships are very important. And we see a lot of people in politics may suggest something, but they don't have the habit of thinking what were the causes of the problem they're trying to solve and what might be the consequences of the action that they might take. And that's a habit that I think we can cultivate in children. They have a problem. Rather than tell them what to do to make it go away, perhaps we should get the habit of asking, how did this come to happen? Why is this situation the way it is? What do you notice or remember? Because we can't generally come up with good solutions to things unless we can understand the causes to some degree, to some degree. A lot of kids, they're kind of default to, I don't know, because that's what they're used to saying when they don't want to have to think, right? But I think we can push this a little bit, and through kind of a daily use of a little bit of Socratic dialogue in life, create this habit of looking for causes, thinking about possible consequences, and connecting ideas. One very important tool that reading provides for us is the ability to compare things. If you've taught writing at all, or you've been taught writing, you generally have teachers say, simile, metaphor, look for that, use that. And of course, when we read the great books, whether they're easier to read great books like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or much more sophisticated content, or the great classics that go back thousands of years, we see that authors have this particular aptitude for helping you understand something by comparing it with something else. And so this activity of comparing two things and saying, what is what are the similarities between these two things? What are the differences between two things? Or here's something, can you think of anything that this is like in some way? And the more I've been at this, the more I realize you really can compare any two things, any two even totally random things. You could look at them and say, you know, here's a pen, there's a cloud. What are some similarities between pens and clouds? And, you know, at first it's a little bit hard because they are pretty weird, but you might come up with a few things. They make shapes. They both contain liquidish substances. They can go through the air, especially if you throw your pen, you know, and you can come up. But that skill of comparison is really one of the very valuable ones, I think. And it exists in that nexus between literature and speaking and writing. The more good comparisons we've read, and sometimes it's even just semi-conscious or subconscious. The author will use a good metaphor or a good simile, and you don't stop and say, "Ooh, that's a good simile," but it gets in there. And if you read the thing more than once, or maybe you hear a very similar one, then that becomes accessible, and you are now ready to make a similar comparison. And that helps us understand all things better. So that that tool of comparison is something I think we should keep in our parenting repertoire. And when we're talking to kids, say, that's really interesting. What does that remind you of? Can you think of anything like that or similar to that in some way? And then don't expect a fast answer, right? You've probably met a person who's thoughtful, and they have somehow avoided our modern compulsion to say things as quickly as we can, right? So we have this habit that you ask me a question, and if I don't start talking in about 4 seconds or less, it becomes very uncomfortable. I find it interesting to observe people who are willing to wait until they've formulated their idea before saying that. Jordan Peterson comes to mind, if you've ever listened to him in an interview. Elon Musk will do this too. I'm trying to think of people that people would know.
My husband is very good at that. And if
Yeah.
you, if it's really important that as the listener to make sure you give that space and don't pop in with your own ideas. Like there's something beautiful in that silence of waiting while there's a thoughtfulness at work.
Good.
I really admire that about my husband for
Well,
sure.
hopefully, your children will be comfortable to kind of imitate that. And I know as a teacher, I have found myself impatient. I'll ask a question and I want an answer because the time is ticking. I've got things to do. Or you just take the first answer the first kid gives you and move on. And then everyone kind of defaults their thinking, saying, well, I don't have to answer this, someone else will. Which is why, you know, Socratic discussion generally happens best in small groups. Actually, the family is the best place to learn this. And having kind of a family debate every now and then, throw out a subject, you know, why should people have dogs? You know, something that little kids can relate to. And then actually work on the pros and the cons. And that gets them thinking about causes and consequences. It gets them thinking about what's similar or different. And just that habit of having that engaged conversation, I think is huge. I think that is so far more valuable than most parents, even most homeschooling parents, really understand.
That's really helpful. And as you were speaking about the importance of teaching that sort of comparison, being able to compare things, especially perhaps things that we wouldn't immediately see a similarity between, but seeing how they're alike, seeing how they're different. Actually, what came to mind first to me was, poetry, poetry. I mean, this is like one of my hobby horses. I send my email subscribers a poem every Monday. We include a lot of poetry in our family morning time. But I think poetry does this so well. It teaches you that kind of analogical thinking where in a very condensed space, right? A poet basically describes something as if it's something else. I mean, that's kind of an essential part of poetry. And so including poetry regularly in what you read and study, I think helps train the mind to think kind of metaphorically, symbolically, to see these analogies and these comparisons, maybe in a way that other literature, well, I wouldn't say it can't do it, but it doesn't do it so succinctly.
No, I would agree. And a lot of kids think they don't like poetry unless it's silly or funny. And I think it's okay to use humorous and delightful kinds of poetry to draw children in. But yes, the poets will force the reader to make inferences. And that's a tremendously good habit, to look at a situation and see it, and then on your own ask questions. Why is that the way it was? Why did he say that the way he did? What would happen if? That's the kind of thing the poet is pushing towards. I've been fascinated with the popularity of memes, right? And I enjoy memes a lot. And what's interesting about memes is that it requires some kind of additional information in order for it to have an effect on you. In order for it to be funny, you have to know something. And if you see a meme and you say, I don't even think that's funny, I don't get it, I don't get it, basically you're lacking a bit of information. And I don't know when the term came into popular use. Certainly, I think for me, I became aware of it just in the last 15 years or so. And now, of course, everybody, talks about memes. But getting into logic, see, there's a logical construction called an enthymeme, which is where you have a premise, two premises, and a conclusion, but you're missing a part of it. So an example of this would be premise one, the test is on Tuesday. Premise two, today is Tuesday. You don't really have to say the conclusion because your mind jumps to, uh-oh, the test is today. And so a well-constructed rhetorical argument will very often do this. It will have these enthymemes embedded, and then the listener feels very clever for having figured out what you were trying to say, not necessarily even thinking that you were trying to lead them to that conclusion. And the good authors do this very well, too. I was reading a book to grandchildren, which I hadn't read for a long, 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 long time. Um, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. And I was struck by the brilliance of the author in that he would set up something and then there'd be kind of a pause, a natural break, a paragraph or a section or a chapter. And the kids would ask a question at that moment. And then the very next sentence would answer the question. It was as though he understood how to set up, how to pique the curiosity of the child listening to the story, and give that pause, and then give the answer. And most of the time, the kids would be like, "I knew that." And so there's this tremendous joy in discovery and knowing things. And this is why, I think we revere these great children's authors. It's not easy to do. It is not easy to write that way. And so that would be, moving children into kind of an informal logic. And so I would look to literature, the good, the great, the classic children's literature, as the best introduction into informal logic. C.S. Lewis being right in there, and then the irony of the professor saying, "Why don't they teach logic in schools anymore?"
Right. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of having something to think about, right? So what we're putting into our children's minds, training them to see similarities, comparisons, reading the great literature. What role do you see writing playing in this development of thinking skills? And how can we effectively guide our children in that area as we're helping train them in thinking truthfully and logically?
Yeah. So Bacon's quote, writing makes an exact person. It is echoed kind of today. One of the things Jordan Peterson words he will use is that writing refines your thinking. So when you say something, it's said, it's done. You move on in a conversation, you move on in a presentation, the debate round goes. You can't really do anything about what you already did because it's gone. But when you write a sentence or you write a paragraph, you should have the habit of reading what you wrote and then always having the question, is that accurately representing what I'm trying to communicate here? Now, for kids, this is usually things happening in stories. And the way they think about writing stories is what happened next, what happened next, what happened next, what happened. And they're creating a little movie in their imagination. And then they're trying to get that movie into words. And they may come up with a sentence that approximates the image that they have. But again, if they have an abundant vocabulary, they might read it, look at the word, and realize there's a better word that I could use right here. Or this idea would be clearer if I put a period and started a new sentence. Or this would be clearer if I added in a word to connect the two ideas, a clausal connector or a conjunction or something. And so when they write something the first time, it's kind of an approximation of what they're imagining. Then they read what they wrote. And sometimes it's funny, they will read it and get a slightly different image than what they started with, right? And then they're going to say, okay, but what I really want to show here, what I really want to say, it needs a different word. It needs a different way. And that's where they then can rely on both their own vocabulary, which hopefully is, developing and well-developing, continue to develop, but also tools like, a thesaurus or a book like A Word Right Now that we sell, or a mom handy. And what's another word for? And I find that when I'm teaching groups of children writing, that group brainstorming of vocabulary and getting a whole long list of whether it's ly words or strong verbs or quality adjectives or whatever, getting those words out in front of the children is like a brain expander, because immediately they have access to a word that might not have been in their active vocabulary, but it's in their passive vocabulary. They recognize it. They say, that's a better word for what I'm trying to do here. They can pull it, and the word hops off the board into their eyes, through their brain, and out their fingers into their paper, and they're able to more accurately reflect the image that they have created. And that is a great joy. And that's where you start to see kids say, this is, they may not say it to you because they don't want to admit, but they will experience, this is fun, this is enjoyable, this is an enriching experience to be able to do this.
In past years, I've done like free writing exercises with my kids where I would I did different versions of this, but a most simplest form would be like, all right, everybody set a timer, 5 minutes. Here's the prompt. Just start writing words down on a page. It could be a story, it could be a thought, it could just be like random things that come to mind. And the idea was to kind of get past that idea of having to write something perfect and to kind of play with words. And I'm imagining that would actually be a really fun thing a homeschool family could do with a wide range of ages, like around the lunch table or in a morning time. Like, okay, mom's going to set a timer for, 3 minutes. Let's see how many synonyms for run or, said we can think of, and just everybody write down as many as they can think of. And then it's kind of like a game. It's not like school, but you're training them to think a little bit differently about their vocabulary.
Yeah, I would suggest that there is a little bit of a danger in that you might have one or more kids who just don't do well at that. They don't get much on paper, and they look at their sister and think, "Oh, she can do this, but I can't." Whereas if you did it in a group on a whiteboard, then everybody can throw in their two bits. Some people can throw in 20 words and someone else maybe only two, but then it's a group success, and you would minimize the danger of, one of the kids thinking, I can't think of anything, and start to dislike it. So that I find group writing has that kind of effect of, you can kind of steal from the rich and give to the poor a little bit. And then, in terms of story starters and things like that, it 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 varies widely. Some kids would really take to that, and others would just be dead in the water. So, again, putting them in teams would be a way where the ones that might not be as uh, naturally or immediately creative could work together and throw in an idea, see that idea, make it in onto the paper, but they wouldn't be cut off from like a source of help or support that way.
Oh yeah, that's a really great tip. Well,
So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna continue on this a little bit more, about getting kids to the point where they really want to read what they wrote and be sure that it is as close to what they're trying to accomplish as possible. Sometimes it's hard for them to do that. Um, and so one of the things I have suggested is that you read aloud to the child the thing they wrote. And then you can use the nuance of expression to help them realize whether something is clear or not so clear. You can comment, you can even ask a question along the way, and then you give it back to them, and they've got a little more to work with. Whereas it's well, you've done writing, Amy, so it is hard to edit yourself. You wrote something, you look at it, it made sense when you wrote it, it still makes sense. You give it to someone else, and they may say, "Well, I don't quite get what you're trying to say here."
When you're like, but it's so clear.
Yes, and my problem is, what's your problem? My response is, well, what's your
Exactly.
problem? Um, but I've noticed that with children, when you read to them what they wrote, they hear it in a different way, a little more objective way than if they just look at the thing that they wrote. And I think that starts to work really well around the age of 11, 12, 13, where they're in that zone, between whatever they write, you're happy with it, it's creative. And then that pushing toward adulthood objectivity that you're trying to cultivate. So, a lot of people have said, how come you don't have the kids read out loud papers in your class? And I say, because I want to read it to them. I want them to hear me read it. And if they read it, they won't hear it the same way. So that's another thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've always encouraged my kids to read their own work aloud as part of their editing process, but I've never thought of how that would come across differently if someone else was reading it, or especially, if I were reading it and was able to kind of use that as an opportunity to help them in that thinking and editing process. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can try it. The other thing is, if I got a group of kids and I read their paper, I will actually be able to read their paper aloud to the group better than they would. That makes their paper sound better. And so they like that. And so that's a couple thoughts. If we were to look also at the tools of invention, right? As I teach them kind of in a simplified, these could go all the way back to Aristotle's Common Topics, but a simplified version for kids would be, there's an acronym that I used in teaching this, DC at sunrise. So DCAS or DCAS. Division, comparison, which we talked about, analysis, and synthesis. So with division, you would say, okay, here's the big subject. Now, what are some things about aspects of topics pertaining to elements of that thing? This is really the one of the most basic skills that you can help kids have. And so they want to write about basketball. Okay. So the first thing you do is try to come up with some possible topics. What are some things about aspects of uh, topics pertaining to elements of basketball? Then they immediately start to go places in their mind. And the word topic is from the Greek topooi, which means place. We get our word topographical map from that same root, topooi. So the topic is the places you can go to explore something. And I have many times seen kids that was, okay, write about the beach, write about, your dog, write about your favorite thing to do, write about your friend, and they're just dead. The beach is a really fun place to be. I really like the beach. It
There's
is
some
fun to
sand.
be there. Okay, but now start division, right? Things you can do at the beach, things you see at the beach, things you hear at the beach, problems with the beach, solution to those problems. You get into those divisions and questions, and immediately that invention process activates. And I would go back to where you started with the quote from Lewis's book. Why don't they teach logic in schools? I think what we've seen over the 100 years or so isn't that they don't teach logic per se, although they don't, and it has been eliminated from the curriculum. More insidious is that the whole culture of education shifted from let's learn how to ask good questions together to here's all the information you need to know from the textbook. I'm going to give it to you. We'll massage it around a little bit and call that, homework and study. Then I'm going to give you the questions. If you answer the questions correctly, you win the game. If you answer the question incorrectly, you lose the game. If you refuse to answer the questions, we'll kick you out. You'll have to go to some special treatment facility somewhere. But if you become a person who asks questions yourself, that's not just irritating. That could be dangerous to the whole system. So we look at kind of the modern conveyor belt, industrialized model of education that started up in the early 1900s. And it really has been a shift from how to ask good questions to knowing all the answers to the questions someone else is going to ask you.
Mhm. That's a really good and important thing to think about. And I'm thankful as homeschool parents, we have an opportunity to do something differently with our own children. It can be a safe place to ask questions and make connections and ask difficult questions, right? And
And
to not always know the answer. That's okay too, right?
the best questions are not easy to answer, and some of them people have been working on for millennia. The it is interesting though, because as more and more people are coming into the homeschooling, and I might say by extension the alternative education world, classical charter schools, hybrid schools, um, there's a shift that's happening. And you will meet people who aren't homeschooling, don't know much about it, but they'll interact with a kid and they will guess, that kid's homeschooled, isn't he? How did you know? Well, because the conversation had a quality to it that is not readily available in the general population of kids that go to school all the time.
Yeah. Andrew, here at the end, I want to ask you the questions that I ask all of my guests before we close. So the first is just what are you personally reading lately? And I'm very curious because the last time we chatted, I think you were reading a book that was like telling you to stop eating cheese or something. So I want to know, what are you reading now?
Well, I do eat cheese, but I select it carefully. So the nonfiction book that I just finished was called The End of the World is Just the Beginning. And uh who wrote it? I know who wrote it because I listened to his podcast, but it it's really kind of a frightening book. I will say that. Peter Zeihan, Zeihan. Um, he basically goes through the the demographics of every country, the economics of every country, the geopolitical circumstances in the world, the changes that are happening, and uh, by the end of it, you're pretty much convinced that things are going to collapse sooner rather than later. The supply chains are going to break apart. The population collapse in some of the very major countries like China, South Korea, and Japan, and parts of Europe is going to decimate the economies. The debt bomb is exploding. But of course, I've been thinking this is going to happen any day now for 10 years. So, but it was a very interesting book from a being aware of the reality of what are the world our kids are growing up in. And half of being ready for major change is being able to imagine what you might do in that situation. So it had benefit from there, but I will warn everybody, it's a pretty bleak book, and he has to stretch himself pretty far to find the silver lining on the clouds. Um, one silver lining is if you live in the United States, you're probably better off than almost anywhere else in the world. And he's got a lot of reasons for that. But then I thought I got to shift over to something much more useful. So I picked up and started the book called Indistractable. And this is a book about how do you be efficient and focused and productive in a world that is designed to continuously distract you in every possible way. So it's a little bit intersects a little bit with James Clear's book Atomic Habits, and that one. The last fiction book I read was truly a delight. And I want to get the author here, so hold on for a second.
While you're looking that up, I'll just say I will recommend, again, to go back to what I said earlier, I will recommend poetry as an antidote to fear about the end of the world or wondering how to approach potential collapse. One of the poems we love to memorize in our family and recite a lot is Death Be Not Proud by John Donne. And I've said this before, but the day I was in the emergency room, the day my son received his leukemia diagnosis, that was the poem that came to mind. And, I had always told my kids, I'm not going to teach you a lot of facts, but I'm going to teach you a lot of poems because one day you're going to be in hard times and those are going to be good to know. And I was like, oh, yeah, I was true. I didn't know I was hiding it in my heart for myself, but yeah, some more poetry.
Yeah, so this book is very poetic. It's just full of literary allusions, and it's a rich, lovely story about a middle-aged woman who's been taking care of her brother, a farmer, and she decides she needs some adventure in her life. And this was written, I think they was set right around when cars started to exist.
Is it Parnassus on Wheels?
Yes, you know that book?
I love that book. Yes, so good.
Isn't it awesome? Yeah, who was the author? Christopher
Morley, I believe.
Morley,
Mhm.
Morley, Morley. Yeah. So yeah, that was a delightful book, and it was just a real relief. It was a relaxing book. I had previously read East of Eden by John Steinbeck, which is really a hard book. It's just painful. And the redemption, you have to slog through a tremendous amount of unhappiness before you get to the redemptive part of the book. And I'm glad I did. And it gave me a completely new respect for Steinbeck, which, most of us have to read some Steinbeck when we're in high school or college or something, but that just goes in and out. You don't think about it. East of Eden took me into some very deep levels of contemplation. But I needed something light. So Parnassus on Wheels, I would recommend to anyone. And the other books I've been reading, I've actually spent more time reading to grandchildren than I have reading on my own. And so I love Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, got James and the Giant Peach right off. And my particular grandchildren I have access to right now really seem to like historical fiction a lot. And so we've been reading stories of medieval knights and crusaders and a lot of stuff in that 13, 14, 1500s period, Adam of the Road, Door in the Wall. And so I like that because I learn a little bit more about historical periods when I read historical fiction, even if it's aimed at kids. And so that's what have you been reading yourself?
Oh, let's see. Well, I just started a book called, I'm looking at it here, Loving Your Adult Children by Gay Clark. So my oldest has recently moved out. I've got, I'm kind of shifting into this mothering of adult children as well as still having some young ones. And then just for fun, I always return to Georgette Heyer when I need a little lighthearted brain relief from reality. So that has also been on my bedside table recently.
How do you spell that last name? Higher?
Heyer. She was an early 20th century writer. So I kind of think of them as if like Jane Austen and Woodhouse had a baby, like they're a little
That
bit.
sounds
But
good.
actually, my favorite are her mysteries. I really enjoy her mysteries that are kind of reminiscent of an Agatha Christie, just with a little bit more of a bite with the dialogue. Very witty. So.
Good. Well, I'll check into that. I'm not familiar with Higher, so I'll look into it. But
Well,
well,
I
you
would
don't
start
work.
with the blunt instrument. Start with blunt instrument as a mystery there.
Okay.
Mhm.
You
Got
don't
a
look
little
old enough
twist,
to
just like an Agatha
have a kid
Christie
who
twist.
moved out of your house. Not a shred of gray on your hair.
Oh, I know. I know. Oh, dear. Well, Andrew, this has been lovely as always. Where can people find you all around the internet?
Well, IEW.com, starting place. YouTube channel, search IEW, search Andrew Pudewa. That's there. I know I have an Instagram page, one for the company, one for myself, but I don't spend much time looking around, so I'm not even sure what my actual name is. But I do have a very unique name, pretty easy to find. So Pudewa, Pudewa, and we have a lot of free lessons available. So if people wanted to just taste our writing or our spelling or our poetry or our grammar programs, any of that, they can go to idw.com/free-lessons and then choose something and download it and just give it a shot, watch the video, whatever. And it may be, oh, that resonates with my student, my kids. Let's try more of that. So we try to make it as easy as possible for people to try what we've got.
Fabulous. And I will have links to all of those things in the show notes for this episode over at humilityanddoxology.com. I would love it if you would take a minute to leave a rating and review in your podcast app wherever you're listening and share this episode with a friend you think would be encouraged. And Andrew, until next time, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your year reading with grandchildren and on your own and exploring words and thought. So thanks again for chatting today.
Thank you, Amy. It's been a delight.